At 10:30 hours on March 22, 1942, a Jewish prisoner, identified only as Subject 37, was stripped naked and locked inside a steel chamber at Dachau concentration camp. The chamber was 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, cylindrical, with a small porthole window and thick walls designed to withstand extreme pressure differentials. SS doctors sealed the door, turned a valve, and began pumping the air out. The chamber was designed to simulate altitude. As air was removed, the pressure inside dropped, mimicking the atmospheric conditions at 20,000 feet, then 30,000, then 40,000, climbing higher than any mountain on Earth. The goal was simple: determine exactly what happens to the human body at extreme altitude. How high can a pilot fly before his body fails? What are the symptoms? How long until death? Can he be saved if brought down quickly enough? The Nazi Luftwaffe needed answers. German pilots were flying higher than ever before, intercepting Allied bombers at 30,000 feet, testing experimental aircraft designed for 40,000 feet and above. But high-altitude flight killed pilots regularly. Hypoxia, oxygen starvation, caused pilots to pass out and crash. Rapid decompression from equipment failure or battle damage could be fatal. The Luftwaffe didn't fully understand the physiological limits. They needed data. And in Nazi Germany in 1942, getting that data meant using human beings as test equipment. Subject 37 didn't know any of this. He knew only that he'd been taken from the camp barracks, told to undress, and locked in a metal cylinder. Through the porthole, he could see SS doctors in white coats watching him. One held a stopwatch, another wrote on a clipboard, a third operated the air pump controls.
The pressure dropped rapidly. The chamber was simulating an ascent of 1,000 feet per second, faster than any aircraft could climb, but useful for testing extreme scenarios. Subject 37 felt his ears pop violently. Then again, pain stabbed through his sinuses. He tried to equalize the pressure by swallowing, but the ascent was too fast. Within 90 seconds, the chamber had reached the equivalent of 30,000 feet. Subject 37 began gasping. The air was too thin. His lungs worked frantically but couldn't pull in enough oxygen. His vision started to narrow, darkness creeping in from the edges. He pounded on the chamber walls. The doctors watched and took notes. One pointed at the subject's lips, which had turned blue. Another noted the time on his clipboard: 2 minutes, 15 seconds. At 3 minutes, Subject 37's movements became uncoordinated. His hands slapped weakly at the walls. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The doctors noted severe hypoxia, loss of motor control. The chamber continued to depressurize. 35,000 feet, 40,000 feet. Altitudes where no human could survive without pressurized oxygen. At 4 minutes, Subject 37 began convulsing. His body thrashed inside the small chamber, limbs striking the metal walls. The doctors leaned closer to the porthole, watching intently. This was the data they needed: exactly how the body reacts when it's starved of oxygen at extreme altitude. One doctor noted the time and symptoms. Subject exhibits grand mal seizure, likely due to cerebral hypoxia.
At 5 minutes, Subject 37's convulsions stopped. He slumped against the chamber wall, unconscious. His chest still moved, shallow, irregular breaths, but his brain had shut down from oxygen starvation. The doctors discussed whether to repressurize. One argued they should continue to see what happened at even higher altitudes. Another wanted to test rapid repressurization to simulate emergency descent. They decided to continue. The chamber reached the equivalent of 50,000 feet. pressure less than 2 pounds per square inch, about 15% of sea level pressure. At this altitude, water boils at human body temperature. The moisture in Subject 37's lungs began to vaporize. His chest heaved once, violently, as his lungs tried to expel the expanding gas. Pink foam bubbled from his mouth and nose, blood mixed with aerated fluid from his disintegrating lung tissue. At 6 minutes, the doctors noted pulmonary hemorrhage and suspected alveolar rupture. Subject 37 was drowning in his own blood while simultaneously suffocating from lack of oxygen. His body made one final convulsive movement, then went completely still. The doctor with the stopwatch noted the time: 6 minutes, 43 seconds from start of decompression to apparent death. But the experiment wasn't over. The doctors wanted to test emergency repressurization, simulating what would happen if a pilot at extreme altitude dove rapidly to lower altitude. Could that save him? Or would the rapid pressure change cause additional damage? They opened the repressurization valve. Air rushed back into the chamber. The pressure climbed rapidly back to sea level equivalent in less than 60 seconds. Through the porthole, they watched Subject 37's body. It didn't move. One doctor noted, repressurization appears ineffective after 6 minutes 43 seconds of depressurization. Subject deceased. They opened the chamber. Subject 37 was dead, eyes open, blood covering his face from the ruptured vessels in his nose, mouth, and lungs. The doctors removed the body, hosed out the chamber, and prepared for the next test.
The Dachau altitude experiments were conducted from February 1942 to May 1942 under the direction of SS-Hauptsturmführer Dr. Sigmund Rascher. Rascher was a Luftwaffe doctor who'd convinced Heinrich Himmler that high-altitude experiments were critical for German-era superiority. Himmler agreed and provided Rascher with prisoners from Dachau concentration camp to use as test subjects. The experiments had two primary goals. First, determine the maximum altitude at which humans could survive and function. This would tell the Luftwaffe how high pilots could fly before oxygen systems became absolutely critical. Second, test methods for reviving pilots who'd been exposed to extreme altitude and low pressure. If a pilot's oxygen system failed at 40,000 feet, could he be saved if his aircraft descended rapidly? Or was the damage irreversible? To answer these questions, Rascher conducted approximately 200 experiments on roughly 200 prisoners. The survival rate was 0. Every prisoner who entered the altitude chamber either died during the experiment or was killed shortly afterward. Rascher wanted clean data, which meant eliminating variables like individual prisoner health differences. The solution was to use each prisoner once, document everything, then dispose of the subject. Fresh prisoner, fresh data. The experiments varied in their protocols. Some tested slow decompression, simulating a gradual climb to altitude, like a bomber slowly ascending to bombing height. Others tested rapid decompression, simulating explosive decompression from battle damage or equipment failure. Some tests went to extreme altitudes, equivalent to 68,000 feet, higher than any aircraft of the era could possibly fly, but useful for understanding absolute limits.
The results were documented in excruciating detail. Rascher filmed many of the experiments, creating a visual record of exactly how humans die from altitude exposure. The films show prisoners gasping for air, convulsing, bleeding from their facial orifices, collapsing unconscious. Some experiments lasted less than 5 minutes. Others went on for 30 minutes or more, with doctors periodically adjusting altitude to prolong observation periods. One experiment, documented in Rascher's notes, tested whether a pilot could regain consciousness after extreme altitude exposure. The subject was decompressed to the equivalent of 47,000 feet for 8 minutes, long enough to cause unconsciousness and brain damage but not immediate death, then rapidly recompressed to sea level. The subject remained unconscious. Rascher administered pure oxygen, stimulants, and even manual chest compressions. The subject never regained consciousness. Autopsy revealed massive cerebral hemorrhaging. The rapid pressure changes had caused blood vessels in the brain to rupture. Another experiment tested whether pilots could survive if they manually breathed pure oxygen during decompression. The subject was given an oxygen mask connected to a pure oxygen supply. As the chamber was decompressed to 40,000 feet equivalent, the subject was instructed to breathe normally from the oxygen supply. Rascher noted that the subject maintained consciousness longer than previous subjects, approximately 11 minutes instead of 4. But the pure oxygen couldn't compensate for the low pressure. Even breathing 100% oxygen, there wasn't enough pressure to force adequate oxygen into the bloodstream. The subject eventually convulsed and died. Rascher concluded that oxygen masks alone were insufficient above 40,000 feet. Pilots would need pressurized suits or pressurized cabins. The most disturbing experiments involved testing the limits of human pain tolerance at altitude. Rascher wanted to know if extreme cold combined with low pressure would speed or slow the dying process. Several prisoners were decompressed while being sprayed with ice water, simulating bailing out of an aircraft at extreme altitude into freezing temperatures. The combination of hypoxia, cold, and pressure changes killed these subjects in under 3 minutes. Rascher noted their suffering was considerable, but provided useful data about the dangers of high-altitude bailouts in winter conditions.
Rascher's experiments weren't isolated. They were part of a broader program of Nazi medical experimentation that used concentration camp prisoners as disposable test subjects for military research. At the same time Rascher was killing people in altitude chambers, other Nazi doctors at Dachau were conducting hypothermia experiments, freezing prisoners to death to test survival gear for downed pilots in the North Atlantic. At Ravensbrück, doctors were testing sulfa drugs by deliberately infecting prisoners with bacteria and seeing if the drugs could cure them. At Auschwitz, Dr. Josef Mengele was conducting genetic experiments on twins. Across the concentration camp system, Nazi doctors were using human beings as laboratory animals. The ethical framework, if it can be called that, was simple. Prisoners were going to die anyway, so why not extract useful data before they died? Rascher wrote to Himmler, "These criminals deserve no mercy, and their death should at least serve the fatherland." This logic allowed him to rationalize killing 200 people in altitude experiments. They weren't people to him. They were experimental subjects, data sources, living instruments. The data Rascher collected was extensive. He documented the exact altitude at which humans lose consciousness, typically between 25,000 and 28,000 feet without oxygen. He documented the time from loss of consciousness to death, typically 4 to 7 minutes, depending on altitude. He documented the physiological symptoms, cyanosis, blue skin, convulsions, hemorrhaging, pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, and death. He documented methods of attempted revival, rapid repressurization, oxygen administration, stimulants, cardiac massage. None worked after consciousness had been lost for more than 3 minutes. He also documented something unexpected: individual variation. Some prisoners lasted longer than others at the same altitude. Some lost consciousness at 24,000 feet, others maintained consciousness to 30,000 feet. Some died in 4 minutes, others took 12. Rascher hypothesized this was due to differences in physical fitness and lung capacity. He began selecting prisoners based on physical condition, trying to isolate variables: athletic prisoners versus sedentary, young versus old, smokers versus non-smokers. Each subgroup was tested to see if their altitude tolerance differed. The results showed that physical fitness provided only marginal advantage, perhaps an extra minute of consciousness, an extra 2 minutes until death. Age mattered more. Younger prisoners, 20s, 30s, survived slightly longer than older ones, 50s, 60s, but the differences were small. At extreme altitude, everyone died. Physical fitness determined whether you died in 5 minutes or 7, The fundamental physiology couldn't be overcome.
Rascher presented his findings at a German Air Force medical conference in October 1942. He showed his films, described his protocols, presented his data on survival times, symptoms, and attempted revival methods. The audience was German military doctors, officers who'd sworn oaths to heal and protect. They watched prisoners die on screen and took notes. The reception was mixed. Some doctors praised the research as a valuable contribution to aviation medicine. One Luftwaffe flight surgeon said the data would save countless German pilots' lives by helping us understand the absolute limits of high-altitude flight. Others were quietly disturbed but said nothing publicly. Criticizing SS research in 1942 Germany was dangerous. One doctor, reportedly, walked out during the film presentation but was later reprimanded for lack of dedication to military science. The data itself was scientifically valid. That's the uncomfortable truth. Rascher's experiments, horrific as they were, produced accurate information about human altitude tolerance. The numbers were reliable, the observations were correct, the conclusions were sound. Post-war aviation medicine largely confirmed his findings. Humans lose consciousness around 25,000 feet without oxygen. Death follows within minutes, and revival becomes impossible after a few minutes of cerebral hypoxia. But the data was also useless in the way Rascher intended. His goal was to help German pilots survive high-altitude combat, but his research didn't provide solutions, it only documented the problem. He'd proven that humans couldn't survive above 25,000 feet without pressurized oxygen, but the Luftwaffe already knew that. He'd proven that pilots couldn't be revived after their brains were starved of oxygen for several minutes, but that was already obvious. The experiments didn't lead to new equipment or new techniques. They just filled notebooks with precise measurements of how people die.
The real value, if any, came after the war. When the Nuremberg trials documented Nazi medical experiments, the altitude data became part of the public record. Aviation medicine researchers in the United States, Britain, and Soviet Union examined the data. It was horrifying, but also useful. It provided precise benchmarks for designing pressure suits, oxygen systems, and pressurized cabins. The numbers Rascher generated by killing 200 people informed the design of equipment that saved thousands of pilots' lives in the jet age. This created an ethical nightmare. Should data obtained through murder be used? If you use it, are you validating the experiments? If you don't use it, did the victims die for nothing? The medical community struggled with this. Some argued the data should be buried and never referenced. Others argued that refusing to use it wouldn't bring the victims back and would only waste their deaths. There was no good answer. The compromise was this. The data could be used, but it had to be contextualized. Any paper that referenced Rascher's altitude experiments had to explicitly state how the data was obtained and condemn the methods. The victims couldn't be anonymous subjects. They had to be acknowledged as murdered prisoners. This became the standard in medical ethics. Data from unethical experiments could be used if necessary, but only with full disclosure and condemnation of how it was obtained. Sigmund Rascher didn't survive the war. In 1944, he was arrested by the SS, not for his experiments, but for fraud. He'd claimed he and his wife had several children, which earned him benefits and promotions. Investigators discovered the children weren't theirs, they'd been kidnapped from other families. Rascher and his wife were both arrested. Himmler, embarrassed by the scandal, ordered them imprisoned. Rascher was held at Dachau, ironically in the same camp where he'd conducted his experiments. As Allied forces approached in April 1945, Rascher was executed by the SS to prevent his capture and testimony.
His research notes survived. Allied investigators found detailed records of the altitude experiments, including films, photographs, and written documentation. The evidence was used at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946-1947. 23 Nazi doctors stood trial for medical war crimes. 15 were found guilty.
7 were sentenced to death and executed. The altitude experiments were central evidence of systematic medical atrocity. But Rascher wasn't tried, he was already dead. And many of the doctors who'd attended his conference presentation, who'd reviewed his data, who'd incorporated his findings into Luftwaffe medical protocols, were never prosecuted. They claimed they didn't know prisoners were being killed. They said they thought the subjects were volunteers or condemned criminals who'd been offered the choice between execution and experimentation. Some of these doctors continued practicing medicine after the war, became professors, wrote textbooks. Their names are still on papers in aviation medicine journals, though their connection to Nazi research is often omitted from their biographies. The altitude chamber Rascher used was dismantled after the war. Allied forces destroyed it, along with much of the medical experimentation equipment at Dachau. But similar chambers existed, and still exist, in aviation research facilities worldwide. They're called hypobaric chambers or altitude chambers. They're used to train pilots, test equipment, and research high-altitude physiology. The difference is that modern tests use volunteers who can stop the experiment at any time, who are medically screened beforehand, who are monitored by doctors ready to intervene if anything goes wrong. Modern altitude chambers have killed people, but accidentally. In 1981, a technician in a U.S. Air Force altitude chamber died when the chamber rapidly depressurized due to equipment malfunction. In 2019, a researcher in China died in an altitude chamber accident. These deaths were tragedies. Investigations were conducted and safety procedures were improved. The fundamental difference from Rascher's experiments, these deaths were accidents, not the goal.
The data from Dachau still exists in medical archives. It's not widely cited anymore. Modern research has generated cleaner, more ethical data using volunteers and simulation. But occasionally, a paper will reference the Nazi altitude experiments, always with condemnation, always with context. The victims' deaths contributed, however horribly, to a knowledge that saves lives today. Every pilot who safely flies above 30,000 feet benefits from pressure suits and oxygen systems designed using data that includes measurements taken as prisoners died in steel chambers at Dachau. That's the legacy of the altitude experiments, knowledge purchased with murder, scientific data written in blood, measurements that are technically accurate but morally unspeakable. The prisoners who died as Subject 37 or Subject 102 are nameless now. Rascher's notes didn't record their names, only their prisoner numbers. They died for science that didn't need them, that could have waited, could have been done ethically, could have saved them instead of killing them. But in Nazi Germany in 1942, science was a weapon, doctors were soldiers, and prisoners were ammunition to be expended. If this story disturbed you, understand that it should. This is what happens when medicine abandons ethics, when data becomes more important than humanity, when people become things. The altitude experiments weren't aberrations. They were the logical endpoint of viewing prisoners as less than human. That philosophy didn't die at Dachau. It resurfaces whenever researchers forget that subjects are people, that consent matters, and that some knowledge isn't worth the cost. Subscribe for more stories from World War II that don't appear in textbooks, the experiments, the atrocities, the history we need to remember to prevent repetition. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and remember, never again only works if we actually remember what happened the first time.